Given that since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, Canadian billionaires are 37. May I dispense? No? Okay, I will continue. Canadian billionaires are $37 billion richer, while the most vulnerable are struggling. The House calls upon government to put in place a new 1% tax on wealth over $20 million and an excess profit tax on big corporations that have been profiteering from the pandemic, and to reinvest the billions of dollars recouped from these measures to A, expand income security programs, to ensure all individuals residing in Canada have a guaranteed livable basic income. B, may I dispense? No? Okay, very good, I'll continue. B, expand health care, including by putting in place a national dental care program and a universal single-payer public pharmacare program. And C, meaningfully implementing the right to housing with the full plan set out in the Recovery for All campaign, and immediately fund for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy delivered by Indigenous housing providers. Que tous ceux qui appuient la motion, qui participent en personne.
All those in the House in person in favor will please say yea.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Duval.
Mr. Duval.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Canning.
Que tous ceux qui s'opposent à la motion et qui participent en personne veuillent.
All those in person opposed will please rise.
Mr. Blair.
Ms. Freeland.
Ms. Freeland.
Monsieur Lametti.
Mr. Lametti.
Ms. McKenna.
Ms. McKenna.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Haidu.
Ms. Haidu.
Monsieur Duclos.
Mr. Duclos.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Mrs. Scholt.
Mrs. Scholt.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Miss Murray.
Miss Murray.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Miss Ing.
Miss Ing.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Hussain.
Mr. Hussain.
Mr. Amos.
Mr. Amos.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. El Khoury.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Saini.
Mr. Saini.
Madame Martinez-Farada.
Madame Martinez-Farada.
Ms. Zerwit.
Ms. Zerowitz.
Mr. Sabera.
Mr. Sabara.
Miss Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Madame Bendayan.
Madame Bendayan.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Mr. Anand Sangre.
Mr. Anand Sangare.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Monsieur Robillard.
Mr. Robillard.
Miss Jasic.
Ms. Jasix.
Mr. Fonseca.
Ms. Fonseca.
Mr. Easter.
Mr. Easter.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baker.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mr. Paulus.
Miss Bergen.
Ms. Bergen.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Miss Alislev.
Miss Alislev.
Monsieur Blaney, Bellechasse, Jetchemin-Lévy.
Mr. Blaney, Bellechasse, Zitchemin-Lévy.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Miss Sahota, Calgary Skyview.
Miss Sahota, Calgary Skyview.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Sloan.
Mr. Sloan.
Monsieur Lew.
Mr. Lew.
Mr. Cumming.
Mr. Cumming.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Ruff.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Monsieur Trudel.
Mr. Trudel.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Monsieur Champoux.
Mr. Champoux.
Madame Charbonneau.
Madame Charbonneau.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca.
Mr. Jonca. Mr. Blanchette-Jonca.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Mr. Beaulieu.
Nous ferons maintenant l'appel des députés qui participent virtuellement.
And now we will hear from those members participating virtually by party order and alphabetical order according to the table list. When your name is called, please indicate whether you are in favor or opposed to the motion. Please ensure that your camera is turned on at all times and that your microphone is turned on only when you vote.
Les députés du Parti libéral.
Liberal members.
Trudeau.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Trudeau, contre, against.
Mr. Algabra.
On a jacket.
Speaker, I vote against.
Mr. Algabra, against, contre.
Ms. Annan.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Annan, against, contre.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Arsenault, contre, against.
Mr. Area.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Area, against, contre.
Mr. Bagnall.
Le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Bagnall.
Le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Baptiste.
I'll just interrupt for. I believe I heard Mr. Bagnall's voice, but the camera wasn't
Very
on.
faint.
Yeah.
Oh, we'll get him at the end. Very good. Thank you.
So Baptiste again.
Wait. You want to call him again?
Mr. Baptiste.
I vote against.
Baptiste, against, contre.
Mr. Beach.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Beach, against, contre.
Ms. Bennett.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Bennett, against, contre.
Madame Bessette.
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Bessette, contre, against.
Madame Bibeau.
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Bibeau, contre, against.
Mr. Biddle.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Biddle, against, contre.
Mr. Blois.
I vote against the motion, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Blois, against, contre.
Mr. Bertina.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Bertina, against, contre.
Madame Brière.
Contre la proposition.
Madame Brière, contre, against.
Mr. Casey.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Casey, contre, against.
Ms. Shager.
Mr. Speaker, against.
Shager, against, contre.
Mr. Chen.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against.
Mr. Chen, against, contre.
Monsieur Cormier.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Cormier, contre, against.
Ms. de Brusen. Ms. de Brusen. Ms. Demoff.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Demoff, against, contre.
Mr. Dong.
Speaker, against.
Mr. Dong, against, contre.
Monsieur Drouin.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Drouin, contre, against.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Dubourg, contre, against.
Mr. Duguid.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Duguid, contre, against.
Ms. Duncan, Etobicoke North.
Je vote contre la motion.
Ms. Duncan, Etobicoke North, contre, against.
Mr. Isasi.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Sassi, against, contre.
Mr. Ellis.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Ellis, against, contre.
Mr. Erskine Smith.
I abstain on the motion.
Mr. Erskine Smith, abstention, abstention.
Monsieur Fergus.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Fergus, contre, against.
Mr. Fillmore.
Against.
Mr. Fillmore, against, contre.
Mr. Finnegan.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Finnegan, against, contre.
Mr. Fisher.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Fisher, contre, against.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Against.
Mr. Fergus, against, contre.
Mr. Fraser.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Fraser, against, contre.
Ms. Fry. Ms. Fry.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Fry, against, contre.
Monsieur Garneau.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Garneau, contre, against.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Président, je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Guilbeault, contre, against.
Mr. Housefather.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Housefather, contre, against.
Miss Hutchins.
Je vote contre la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Ms. Hutchins, contre, against.
Monsieur Iacono. Monsieur Iacono. Joly.
Je vote contre la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Madame Joly, contre, against.
Miss Jones. Miss Jones. Mrs. Jordan.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mrs. Jordan, against, contre.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Johari, against, contre.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Callaway, against, contre.
Ms. Khalid.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Khalid, against, contre.
Ms. Kara.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Kara, against, contre.
Ms. Kuzmarchek.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Kuzmarchek, against, contre.
Madame Lalonde.
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Lalonde, contre, against.
Ms. Lambropoulos.
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Lambropoulos, contre, against.
Ms. Latanzio.
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Latanzio, contre, against.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Je vote contre la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Monsieur Lauzon, contre, against.
Monsieur Leblanc.
Monsieur le Président.
Pouvez-vous répéter, s'il vous plaît, Monsieur Leblanc?
Oui, je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Leblanc, contre, against.
Madame Leboutillier.
Je vote contre la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Madame Leboutillier, contre, against.
Monsieur Lefebvre.
Je vote contre la motion.
Lefebvre, contre, against.
Mr. Long.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Long, contre, against.
Mr. Longfield.
I vote against.
Mr. Longfield, against, contre.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga, against, contre.
Mr. Macaulay Cardigan.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Macaulay Cardigan, against, contre.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Maloney, against, contre.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. May Cambridge, against, contre.
Mrs. McCrimmon.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. McCrimmon, contre, against.
Mr. McDonald.
Je vote contre de la motion.
Mr. McDonald, contre, against.
Mr. McGinty.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. McGinty, against, contre.
Mr. McKay.
Against the motion.
Mr. McKay, against, contre.
Mr. McKinnon, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. McKinnon, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam, against, contre.
Mr. McLeod, Northwest Territories.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. McLeod, Northwest Territories, against, contre.
Mr. Mendicino.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Mendicino, against, contre.
Monsieur Miller.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Miller, contre, against.
Miss Monsef.
I vote against.
Ms. Monsef, against, contre.
Miss O'Connell.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. O'Connell, against, contre.
Mr. O'Regan. Mr. O'Regan. Miss Petitpas-Taylor.
Je vote contre la motion.
Ms. Petitpas-Taylor, contre, against.
Mr. Pulowski.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Pulaski, against, contre.
Miss Qualtrough.
I vote against the motion.
Qualtrough, against, contre.
Mr. Regan.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Regan, contre, against.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Rogers, against, contre.
Mrs. Romanado.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mrs. Romanado, contre, against.
Ms. Sahota, Brampton North.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Sahota, Brampton North, against, contre.
Mr. Sajan.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Sajan, against, contre.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Sanson, contre, against.
Mr. Senga.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Sanga, against, contre.
Mr. Senga, can you repeat, please? The camera did not kick in.
I vote against the motion.
No one.
Thank you.
All right.
Mr. Sanga, against, contre.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Sarai, against, contre.
Mr. Scarpellegia.
I vote against the motion.
Scarpellegia, against, contre.
Monsieur Shifke.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Shifke, contre, against.
Monsieur Seri.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Seri, contre, against.
Ms. Groh.
Je vote contre la motion.
Ms. Groh, contre, against.
Madame Shanahan.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Shanahan, against, contre.
Mr. Sheehan.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Sheehan, against, contre.
Mr. Sido, Brampton East.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Sido, Brampton East, against, contre.
Ms. Sido, Brampton South.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Sido, Brampton South, against, contre.
Mr. Sims.
I vote against.
Mr. Sims, against, contre.
Mr. Spengeman.
I'm against the motion, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Spengeman, against, contre.
Ms. Tassi.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Tassi, against, contre.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Turnbull, against, contre.
Mr. Van Buyden.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Van Buyden, contre, against.
Mr. Vancouverden.
I vote against.
Mr. Vancouverden, against, contre.
Monsieur Vandal.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Vandal, contre, against.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Vandenbeld, against, contre.
Mr. Vaughan.
I abstain.
Mr. Vaughan, abstention, abstention.
Mr. Varani.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Varani, contre, against.
Mr. Weiler.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Weiler, contre, against.
Mr. Wilkinson.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Wilkinson, against, contre.
Miss Yip.
Je vote contre la motion.
Miss Yip, contre, against.
Miss Young.
Je suis contre la motion.
Miss Young, contre, against.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mrs. Zaid, against, contre.
Miss Zan.
Je vote contre la motion.
Miss Zan, contre, against.
Monsieur Zubiri.
Je vote contre la motion. I'm against the motion.
Monsieur Zuberi, contre, against.
Les députés du Parti conservateur.
Mr. Al-Boutaif.
Je vote contre.
Mr. Al-Boutaif, contre, against.
Mr. Aitchison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I vote against the motion.
Aitchison, against, contre.
Mr. Albus.
Je vote contre la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Albus, contre, against.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Allison, against, contre.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Arnold, against, contre.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Barlow, against, contre.
Mr. Barrett.
I vote nay. Against.
Mr. Barrett, against, contre.
Mr. Benzin.
I vote against.
Mr. Benzin, against, contre.
Monsieur Berthold.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Berthold, contre, against.
Mr. Bazan.
I am opposed to the motion.
Mr. Bazan, can you repeat? The camera did not kick in.
Mr. Speaker, I am opposed to the motion.
Bazan, against, contre.
Thank you.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Bragdon, against, contre.
Mr. Broussard. Mr. Brassard. Mr. Carey.
Je vote contre.
Mr. Carey, contre, against.
Mr. Chu.
I vote against, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chu, against, contre.
Mr. Cooper.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Cooper, against, contre.
Mr. Dalton.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Dalton, contre, against.
Ms. Dancho.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Dancho, against, contre.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Davidson, against, contre.
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. D'Entremont, against, contre.
Mr. Diot.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Diot, against, contre.
Mr. Dowdall.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Dowdall, against, contre.
Mr. Duncan, Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry. Mr. Duncan, Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry. Mr. Epp.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Epp, against, contre.
Mrs. Falk, Battlefords, Lloydminster.
I vote against the motion.
Mrs. Falk, Battlefords, Lloydminster, against, contre.
Mr. Falk, Provencher.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Falk, Provencher, against, contre.
Mr. Fast. Mr. Fast. Ms. Finley, South Surrey, White Rock.
Mr. President, I vote against the motion.
Finley, South Surrey, White Rock, against, contre.
Ms. Finley, Haldeman, Norfolk.
Vote against the motion.
Finley, Haldeman, Norfolk, against, contre.
Monsieur Généreux.
Vote contre la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Généreux, contre, against.
Mr. Jenis.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Jenis, against, contre.
Ms. Gledoux.
Je vote contre la motion.
Ledoux, contre, against.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Godin, against, contre.
Monsieur Gourde.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Gourde, contre, against.
Ms. Gray.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Gray, against, contre.
Mr. Hallan.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Hallan, against, contre.
Ms. Harder.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Harder, against, contre.
Mr. Hoback.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Hoback, can you repeat? The camera did not kick in.
I vote against the motion.
Thank you.
Mr. Hoback, against, contre.
Ms. Jensen.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Jensen, against, contre.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Genereux, against, contre.
Mr. Kent.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Kent, against, contre.
Mr. Kitchen.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Kitchen, against, contre.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Kimmich, against, contre.
Mr. Cram.
I vote against the motion.
Cram, against, contre.
Mr. Couric.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I vote against the motion.
Mr. Couric, against, contre.
Mrs. Cousy. Mrs. Cousy. Mr. Lake.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Lake, against, contre.
Mr. Lawrence.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Lawrence, contre, against.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Lewis Essex, contre, against.
Mr. Leipert.
I vote against the motion.
Leipert, against, contre.
Mr. Lloyd.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Lloyd, against, contre.
Mr. Lobb.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Lobb, against, contre.
Mr. Lukivsky.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Lukivsky, against, contre.
Mr. McKenzie.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. McKenzie against called.
Mr. Maguire.
Vote against.
Mr. Maguire against called.
Monsieur Martel. Monsieur Martel.
Je vote contre.
Mr. Martel contre. Against.
Mr. Mazier.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Mazier against called.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Against the motion.
Mr. Macaulay, can you repeat? The camera did not kick in.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Thank you.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West against called.
Mr. McColman.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. McColman against called.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. McLean against called.
Mrs. McLeod, Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mrs. McLeod, Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou against called.
Mr. Malilo.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Malilo against called.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Moore against called.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Morantz against called.
Mr. Motts.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Motts against called.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Nader against called.
Mr. Padzer.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Patzer against called.
Mr. Polyev.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Polyev against called.
Mr. Reyes.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Reyes against called.
Mr. Redekop.
I vote against the motion.
Redekop against called.
Mr. Reid.
Against, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Reid against called.
Ms. Rempel Gardner.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Rempel Gardner against called.
Ms. Rood.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Rood against called.
Mr. Soroya.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Soroya against called.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Scheer against called.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Schmale against called.
Mr. Shields. Mr. Shields.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Shields against called.
Miss Shin.
Je vote contre la motion.
Ms. Shin called against.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Shipley against called.
Mr. Soroka.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Soroka against called.
Mr. Stanton.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Stanton called against.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Stanley against called.
Mr. Strahl.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Strahl against called.
Mr. Sweet.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Sweet against called.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Tucker against called.
Mr. Van Pupta.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
And Pupta against called.
Mrs. Vecchio. Mrs. Vecchio. Mr. Vidal.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Vidal against called.
Mr. Viersen.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Viersen against called.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Viss against called.
Mr. Workington.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Workington against called.
Mr. Waugh.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Waugh against called.
Mr. Weber.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Weber against called.
Mr. Williamson.
Pardon me, I vote against the motion, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Williamson against, contre.
Mrs. Wong.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mrs. Wong against, contre.
Mr. Yurdiga.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Yurdiga against, contre.
Mr. Zimmer.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Zimmer against, contre.
Les députés du Bloc.
Members of the Bloc québécois.
Monsieur Barcelou-Duval.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, contre, against.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Je suis contre cette motion.
Bergeron, contre, against.
Monsieur Boudria.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Boudria, contre, against.
Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe, contre, against.
Madame Chabot.
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Chabot, contre, against.
Madame Desbiens.
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Desbiens, contre, against.
Monsieur Fortin.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Fortin, contre, against.
Madame Godreau.
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Godreau, contre, against.
Madame Gill.
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Gill, contre, against.
Madame Larouche.
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Larouche, contre, against.
Monsieur Lemire.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Lemire, contre, against.
Madame Michaud.
Je vote contre la motion.
I would ask all members who are not voting to please mute their microphones. Otherwise, their picture shows up. We can all see them, but we know that's not their turn to vote. And could I get, I'm sorry, who was it? Madame Michaud. Madame Michaud, pouvez-vous répéter, s'il vous plaît?
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Michaud, contre, against.
Madame Normandin.
Je vote contre la motion.
Madame Normandin, contre, against.
Madame Posé.
Contre la motion.
Madame Posé, contre, against.
Monsieur Perron.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Perron, contre, against.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Je vote contre la motion.
Plamondon, contre, against.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, contre, against.
Monsieur Simard.
Contre la motion.
Monsieur Simard, contre, against.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Je vote contre la motion.
Sainte-Marie, contre, against.
Monsieur Thériault.
Je vote contre la motion.
Thériault, contre, against.
Monsieur Terrien.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Terrien, contre, against.
Madame Vignola.
Je suis contre la motion.
Madame Vignola, contre, against.
Les députés du nouveau...
Members of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Singh.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Singh, for, pour.
Mr. Angus.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Angus, for, pour.
Miss Ashton.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Ashton, for, pour.
Mr. Blakey.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Blakey, for, pour.
Ms. Blaney, North Island, Powell River.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Blaney, North Island, Powell River, for, pour.
Monsieur Boulris.
Je vote pour la motion.
Boulris, pour, for.
Miss Collins.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Collins, for, pour.
Mr. Davies.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Davies, for, pour.
Mr. Garrison.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Garrison, for, pour.
Ms. Gazan.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Gazan, for, pour.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Mr. Green, for, pour.
Mr. Harris.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Mr. Harris, for, pour.
Madame Hughes.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Hughes, pour, for.
Miss Kwan.
I am for the motion.
Ms. Kwan, for, pour.
Mr. McGregor.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Mr. McGregor, for, pour.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Mr. Massey, for, pour.
Ms. Matheson.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Ms. Matheson, 4 pour.
Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Ms. McPherson, 4 pour.
Les députés du Parti vert.
Members of the Green Party.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mrs. Atwin, 4 pour.
Mr. Manley.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Mr. Manley, 4 pour.
Ms. May, Sandwich Gulf Islands.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. May, Sandwich Gulf Islands, 4 pour.
Les députés indépendants.
Independent members.
Mr. Tabera.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Tabera, 4 pour.
Ms. Wilson-Raybould.
The question they're going to ask me, how much do I make now? Like $250?
I'm sorry, Ms. Raybould. I want to remind the honourable members to turn off their microphones when they're not voting. Ms. Raybould, please continue. Or Wilson-Raybould, please continue.
Mr. Speaker, I abstain from voting on the motion.
Mrs. Wilson-Raybould, abstention, abstention.
How come you didn't call my name?
Very good. If your name was not mentioned, please hang on for a second. Assuming that you did not hear the question, or that you did hear the question, if you wish to register your vote and weren't able to do so due to technical difficulties that are now resolved, use the raised hand function and the chair will recognize you. Mr. Bagnall. We have problems with sound. Okay, we've got a thumbs down.
Mr. Bagnall, contre, against.
Ms. Jones.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Jones, against, contre.
Monsieur Iacono.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Iacono, contre, against.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Speaker, I vote, I don't know if you can hear me, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Brassard, against, contre.
Did that work? Okay, good.
Mr. Duncan.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Duncan, Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry, contre, against.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Fast, against, contre.
Ms. Kuzi.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'ai entendu les questions et je vote contre la motion.
Mrs. Kuzi, contre, against.
Monsieur Desilets.
Petit problème technique, désolé, je vote contre la motion. Merci.
Mr. Desilets, contre, against.
Mr. O'Regan. Can you show a thumbs up or down? We didn't get any sound. Very good. Thank you.
Mr. O'Regan, against, contre.
I believe Ms. Ratanzi had a point of order, but she didn't put her hand up, so...
Mr. Speaker, I didn't... Oops, Daisy. I didn't have a point of order. I just wanted to say that I didn't hear the question, so I couldn't vote.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, that's noted.
Yeas pour 27, 27. Nays contre 292, 292.
Je déclare la motion rejetée.
The motion is defeated.
We have a point of order, Ms. Jansen.
Yes, a few minutes ago, you just instructed all members to have a neutral background in view, not to have any props. And yet, one of our members that voted here ignored you and held up a prop while abstaining. I wonder if maybe it needs to be repeated.
Very good. I will repeat that. For all the members, whether you are, order. Whether you're voting or abstaining, we ask you to keep a very neutral background, one that reflects what is going on in the chamber.